Hi, this is Sierra, Operations Coordinator here at Kootenai Electric, and you're watching Electrification Unplugged.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Electrification Unplugged. This is a special edition of our podcast where we take a deep dive into the electric industry and the challenges we are facing. I'm Melissa Newcomer, KEC's Manager of Member Experience.
And I'm Reed Christensen. I'm the Chief Operating and Financial Officer here at Kootenai Electric. Today we have a special guest. Doug Elliott, our General Manager and CEO, has joined us. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you, Reed and Melissa. Nice to be with you this morning.
If you're kind of surprised that we have this video podcast or that you've never even heard that we've had a podcast before, we definitely encourage all of our members to go back and listen to some of the earlier episodes. They set a really good base for what we're going to talk about today. We talk about challenges in the power supply industry. We talk a little bit about, how our rates are structured, and it's a good foundation based on our Electrification Unplugged series of articles. So definitely check that out. You can access our podcast episodes at all major podcast platforms, Spotify, Amazon, Apple Podcast, or you can just go to our website, kec.com, and access them there.
So we're recording this in early February of 2026. We're recording it as a response to some of the questions that we've received as a cooperative we've changed our rates in January, and this is to help answer a lot of the questions we've received. We want to cover the new peak use charge and what that is. We want to cover some of the broader questions that have led to the peak use charge. So we're going to talk about the grid and the state of the grid and some of the issues going on there. But also just trying to answer some of the questions that we've received directly and have Doug here to grill him as best as we can.
And just to note, if you are new to the podcast, it's not typically in video format, but we wanted to have a special video edition today because we have some supplementary slides that we'll be showing that we felt like would be good context to share as well.
All right.
Is there anything you want to say off the bat, or should we just dive into the questions?
I say we should dive right in.
All right. So the first question is kind of a common one that we get from members, and it's just why did we need to go through and redesign the rates? What was wrong with the old rate structure?
It's a great question, Melissa. We do get that a lot. And I think the best way to answer that question is to kind of go back into history and look at utilities from their inception. So early on, when the first electric utility got started out in the East Coast, they were producing electricity for primarily lighting. And they would connect customers with the lighting load, and they would bill them based on the total volume of electricity that those lights used. Well, as you added additional customers and additional lights, you had to build additional infrastructure, and that infrastructure required costs. So if you had a customer who was just using their singular light at night, and maybe they only used it on the weekends, they used a very small amount of energy, but when you billed them for the amount of energy used, it wasn't enough to recover all the fixed costs of keeping that system up to date. So they introduced the fixed use charge, and that's been part of electric rates almost since a decade after the creation of electric utilities. And that methodology worked quite well up until about 2 decades ago. And a couple decades ago, we started seeing utilities facing a new problem. It's not just how much energy they were using and how much it cost to cover the fixed costs, but it also was how much energy was being used at any given amount of time. And as the grid has become increasingly challenged and strained, that has become a greater problem. So now we have to make sure that our rates are recovering that component of our costs as well. And I think one of the things that we're going to get into later in this podcast is all of the things that have compounded to make that a reality. But the short answer to your question is we have to make sure that our cost recovery through our rates is reasonably in line with how we incur costs. And a greater portion of that has to do with the peak volume of energy that our customers are using.
So what would have been the ramifications if we just would have increased the kilowatt hour charge and had no demand component to residential rates whatsoever? And we just said, okay, well, we've got higher costs. We need to recover them somehow. And so let's just increase the kilowatt hour charge. What would happen there?
It's a great question, and there's, I guess, two different ways to look at that. First of all, if you are a customer who is average and you're living in a 1,800 to 2,500 square foot home or an apartment, and you're using a average amount of electricity, the way that our rate is designed is the first 5 kW of that, or actually median peak use, is provided at no cost. It's all that power incremental to that that is causing some strain on the grid. Now consider that customer in comparison to someone who might be living in a 25,000 square foot home, or someone who has a couple electric vehicles and a pool and a spa and a heated driveway. It's that extra electric use that is atypical that needs to, we need to recover the costs for outside of the norm. Another way of looking at it is, absent this cost, there is an increasing incentive for people to install solar on the rooftop. And you might say that's not a bad thing, and I think I would agree, as long as those who are choosing to install solar on their house aren't being subsidized by the rest of our members who may not be in a position to be able to incur that type of cost themselves. So this is really a way of making sure that our rates are aligned with cost causation.
Gotcha. So that what we're really trying to do in this is to reduce or eliminate the amount of subsidization that we're seeing, across the membership, so that essentially the cost causers become the cost payers instead of everybody having to pay, a little bit of a fair share when it's really may not be attributable to the incremental power they're using.
Yeah, I would say that's a good part of it. I wouldn't say that's the only reason for this change. The other underlying issue is that the grid, as we'll get into here in just a little bit, is very constrained, and we need to make sure that our cost recovery through our rates is in line with how our power suppliers and how the transmission grid bills us. And if we get that out of kilter, we can run into a time where we end up being very financially constrained. So Reed, as our CFO, is responsible for making sure all of our bills get paid in a timely way. And if you think back on having a rate design that is all volumetric by just how much energy that you purchase, excluding fixed cost recovery, and then you had a season where, like this month, where we have been unseasonably warm weather. We're not selling a lot of power, but we are receiving a lot of fixed costs that we have to recover. We could find ourselves in a situation where we don't have the cash to pay our bills. On the other hand, we could have a January, very much like we had in 2024, where our customers are using a tremendous amount of electricity and more than paying for the fixed cost. So this is a way of really helping us levelize our costs and keep our rates more modest and anticipated for members.
One thing I'd like to add to that, Doug, is that we are a not-for-profit utility. We're owned by the membership, and so when we talk about revenue and costs, we only collect enough revenue to cover our costs, and anything left over is allocated to the membership and is redistributed to them later on after we've used it to fund our operations and our capital investments. So one of the things that we wanted to cover is what have we done to engage the membership on these changes to the billing?
Yeah, so I had an epiphany about 2 or 3 years ago. We were looking at our current membership and how long our members had been members. And we've had this perspective that when we say something or we communicate, that message really sticks with our membership and they can remember it. Well, the reality is 40% of our membership at the time that we did that analysis had been members for less than 5 years. So while we're growing between 800 to about 1,200 members per year, we also have churn. And that churn, people are moving out, they're moving in. So 40% of our membership had not been aware of all of the communication that we do, just about what you just said about being a not-for-profit cooperative, where our power comes from, how capital credits work, why we have rate designs the way that we are. So because of that, we decided to just go through a whole new communication campaign to explain some of these really important concepts to our members. Melissa, why don't your team was very involved in that communication program, which this podcast is a part of. Why don't you explain what we've done in the last year or two to help members understand what we're planning with these rates?
So leading up to the rate redesign, we published a series of articles that laid the groundwork for why the change was going to be necessary. Following those articles, we did a thorough analysis of our rates and what the rates would need to look like in order to continue to recover costs equitably. And then following that analysis, we held some member workshops and communicated with the members, tried to give them an idea of how these changes could impact them. We had a comment period where we allowed members to give us some feedback and attend workshops both in person and virtually. And then we gathered all that feedback together and it was reviewed by the board. And then that feedback is what then went into the final rate redesign that took effect.
Yeah, and if I just add a little bit to that, when we redesigned our rates with this new peak use charge, we designed it so that it would be revenue neutral. And 70% of our customers billed under this rate actually end up having a rate that a monthly rate that is lower than what they otherwise would have under the old rate. Unfortunately, 30% of our customers end up having a higher rate. And again, back to my earlier comment, the reason for that is that those 30% of our customers are creating a growing issue for the cooperative in regards to the demand charges that our power suppliers bill us. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later.
Okay. Well, one of the other questions that we've seen is, or the comments rather, is that this change was needed to pay for our new building. So how would you respond to members about that?
I've heard that too. And I can understand how members might come to that conclusion, but it is an unfortunate misconception. So first thing to think about is we operated out of our Hayden headquarters for more than 4 decades. We moved into that facility back in the 80s. When we built that facility, we had 30 employees and we served 8,000 customers. And as you know today, we have over 35,000 customers and we have a staff of 120. Over the span of my 17 years as CEO, 15 of which were in that building, we renovated that facility 4 times. And we were facing yet a 5th renovation. So we asked the architect to help us understand how to best accommodate our growing needs for the next decade. And frankly, we didn't like the answer that the architect gave us. Basically, he said that we needed to rebuild a new facility. So we hired a second architect to give us a better answer. And that architect came back with the exact same answer. And the problem is the Hayden headquarters was sitting on 15 acres of land, 10 acres of which were on one side of Dakota Avenue, 5 on the other. You see all these line trucks around. These line trucks require space to operate. All of the equipment and materials that we have to inventory to keep up with the growth has to be kept on the site. So we had these trucks that were parked outside they would get snowed on, and our line crews, to respond to an outage in the middle of the night, would report to the headquarters and spend 45 minutes to an hour digging a truck out just to be able to go respond to an outage. All the while, our members are without power. So it was just not an efficient use of the equipment. We had reels of wire like this, and you can imagine this sitting out in the sun, and the winter causes this wood to deteriorate, and you get heavy cable on a wooden reel, and that reel over time will deteriorate and fall apart, and then it becomes very difficult for that to be used in construction. Oftentimes you just have to scrap the reel of wire, and all the while wire is getting more and more expensive. So when you added up all of those costs, it ended up being considerably less expensive to build an entirely new headquarters. Another dimension of that I think is oftentimes overlooked is we had the ability to operate out of our Hayden headquarters for 3 years while we planned this facility. But had we stayed where we were at to rebuild the headquarters to meet our needs over the next 10 years, we would have had to move somewhere else. So yeah, we have a really nice building, but we need one for the next 40 years.
Understood.
So I'll jump in here, Doug. One of the things is that we are working in this truck bay here. It's a 24/7 operation, so there's going to be noises in the background as we do this. So please excuse that. But one of the things I wanted to add to what you just said, Doug, was when we were considering the building and the cost of the building to the cooperative, as the CFO, I was tasked with modeling financially how this looked for the cooperative. And one of the interesting things about it, and one of the virtues of being a cooperative, is that we can borrow long-term rates for 30 years and spread those costs over 30 years. So that is, so when we when we plugged the building into our financial model for the next 10 years, it came out to be a 5% increase, and we spread that out over 10 years. So every year there's about a 0.5% increase in rates associated with the building. So it really is not a huge driver at all to the increase in rates. It's more to something we'll talk about, and that is the grid and the power we're buying. So just wanted to add that bit of color to what you just said.
Two things I think I would add to that. One is it's important to recognize that had we built a headquarters and renovated on the Hayden site, that number would have been higher. So the impact of this facility was less.
Right.
The other thing I will add to that is that when you say that the impact is 0.5% per year spread over a 10-year period, or 5% total, if you look at the rate increases that we've had over the last 2 or 3 years, last year was 9.7%, this year was 7.75%. Clearly, the building is not the answer to what's driving rate increases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's a great point. Thank you.
One of the things that we've heard online is that it's the growth in Kootenai County that's driving rates up, that the growth is impacting their rates. And what sort of response do you have to that?
I would have to say patently untrue. And here's the reason for that. I mentioned earlier we were growing between 800 to 1,200 customers per year. And most of our load, about 70 to 75% of our load, is residential in nature. So what that looks like for us is subdivision growth. And it's true. And I know many in the community are frustrated by the congestion that growth has caused to roads. It's caused to our schools. It is noticeable. But for electric utility, when we expand into a subdivision, the developer of that subdivision is responsible for paying for the cost of the facilities necessary to serve that development. So the growth of that development pays for the growth of that development. So that is not a factor that is influencing our rates. In fact, maybe something that's influencing our rates even more is aging infrastructure. If you're in a home that was built 30 years ago, the transformer that's serving your home or the wires that is extending service needs to be upgraded. It needs to be maintained. And the cost of replacing that over time is baked into our rates. So that does have a cost pressure. So I could almost make the case that low growth really helps us spread our fixed costs over a larger footprint and helps keep our rates otherwise lower than they otherwise would. Growth in our case is actually a good thing. Now, one other factor about growth is that growth is contributing to some of the rate pressures that we're seeing. And I'm going to talk a little bit more later in this podcast, but it's not our growth. It's growth that is occurring across the entire Pacific Northwest that is the issue that we need to be mindful of.
So to sum it up, local growth is actually good. And I've seen that in my financial models when I adjust how many new meters we add a year, and when I decrease that, it has a negative effect on our future rates. So I know that's what's going on. But growth in the region, that is the challenge right now.
Yeah, and it's because we can design our rates and our member extension costs to cover our own local growth. We have very little control in how our rates are influencing regional growth.
Mm-hmm.
So one other comment that that we've seen sometimes that I wanted to bring up with you is what about the staff pay? Are raises or bonuses the reason why we needed to go through this rate redesign?
So that's a really good question, Melissa. Every year we do a compensation analysis. Purpose of the compensation analysis is to make sure that the wages and benefits that our employees earn is competitive with that of our regional peers. I'm going to use an alignment as an example. The alignment is the person in our industry who basically everything is baked around. They're the ones who are operating and maintaining our system. They're the ones who are building our system. They are the position that every utility in the Northwest needs. So it's a great way to visualize this. Within an hour drive of a lineman who lives in Kootenai County, that lineman could work for any one of 6 or 7 other electric utilities. So if we're going to maintain that lineman as an employee of KEC, we have to pay a wage that is competitive with that of their peers. Because a lineman can be a lineman here, or they can be a lineman with Avista, or Inland Power, or Northern Lights, or any one of these other 6. So it's really crucial that we establish wages for our linemen, our accountants, our engineers, our member service reps, that is competitive with that of their peers that are in other industries in the area. When you look at our wage growth over the years, and don't get me wrong, we work in a great industry and we have good jobs, but when you take a look at the wage growth and wage pressure that has to be recovered through rates year over year, our wage growth accounts for about 1 to 1.5% of total rate pressure. So again, when you look at the rate pressure that we experienced over the last 2 to 3 years, growing in excess of the pace of inflation, 1.5% of that being influenced by the cost of pressures and wage growth in the region, that's not the answer to what's causing these rate pressures either.
Thank you very much.
One of the things that I feel like we really need to talk about is the status or the state of the grid and what's going on there. And me and you, just this week, we're in Portland for a couple days attending some power supply meetings. And honestly, I've been going to these meetings with you for 5 years now, and there's been times where I actually lose sleep over the state of the grid. I feel like it's a slow motion disaster, and it's alarming what's going on, but there's not a whole lot of attention. I feel like it should be like on the front page of every newspaper in the region, but it's not getting that attention. And it's obviously having an impact on our rates. As supply and demand it's a supply and demand thing. But I think it would really be beneficial to go over some of what is going on in the grid right now, and what we're doing as KEC to help with the situation. I feel like we're one of many utilities in the region. We have some benefits in that we have a slice of the Bonneville Power Administration, like the hydro dams. Like we have that, but also it's a diminishing resource. But I'd love to hear you kind of explain that a little bit more. And I think during this part we'd probably want to share some slides with our listeners.
Can I
Yeah.
just ask one thing
Sure.
before you get into that answer? We talk about the grid a lot, and I just think it'd be really
Yeah.
important to define for members who aren't in the weeds of power supply as much as we are. What is the grid? Is it Kootenai Electric's power lines? Is it Idaho's power lines? What could you just give us just a quick definition of what the grid is?
Let me do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Doug's the expert.
It's all of that.
Okay.
I like to explain the grid like this. The grid is the most complicated machine ever built by humans. In the Northwest, it comprises over 20,000 miles of high voltage lines that provide power from central generating stations to loads like all of our members. So it's this living, breathing, pulsing entity that delivers power from the point of generation to the point of use. And if you can imagine the circulatory system of your body kind of being like the grid of the region, the veins and the arteries are what delivers power from those generating stations to loads. At any given time, power can be flowing. One moment it'll be flowing one direction, the next minute it'll be flowing another, just depending upon the loads of the system. The other thing that's important to consider is that we have a really hard time storing energy. So I always say that electricity is not able to be inventoried very easily. It has to be produced the moment it's consumed. So we have this issue of load following. When you turn on your light switch, there has to be a generation station or a generator operator somewhere that's turning up or turning down the power produced by that fleet of generation resources to make sure the power being produced at that moment matches the load.
Awesome. Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah. So to get back to your very terrifying question, it keeps me up at night as well. And for the last 3 to 4 years, we've been increasingly hearing this same narrative that we have a resource adequacy issue in not just the Northwest, but really nationwide. And what's contributing that? And what is resource inadequacy? So 70% of our power comes from the federal hydro projects that operate in the Columbia River system. We have access to this really inexpensive and renewable resource of generation that has been the bread and butter of the electric utilities in the Northwest. The other 30% of that has to come from other non-federal resources. And the reason for that is the dams are operating at capacity. We can't get any more power out of them than they already produce. The problem is that those dams, the youngest of them is 48 years old. I want to take a guess how the oldest one is?
Probably 80, I don't know.
116 years old.
160, okay.
116 years old. And that's the fleet of generation assets that is powering 70% of our load. I talked about the grid. So that veins and arteries is delivering that 70% plus the 30% that we have to buy from other resources from the point of generation to our system, comes across 20,000 miles of high voltage transmission lines. Bonneville operates 75% of those. So they have about 15,000 miles of high voltage lines. The majority of those were built between 1940 and 1960. So what's the operational life of a transmission line? Well, it's quite long, but it's not that long. And those lines have to be upgraded, they have to be maintained, they have to be replaced. A wood pole, for instance, in a transmission system may last 50 or 60 years, but when it reaches its end of its life, it has to be replaced. And replacing that infrastructure costs a lot of money. And that's part and parcel of the issues that are driving our increased costs. Now, you talked about resource inadequacy. Another issue that I'd like to talk about, and let me just pull up a slide here.
For those of you listening and not able to watch this podcast, we will post all of these slides in the description of the episode. So we'll describe them well in the conversation, but you can also refer back to them later.
Yeah, so this slide that I wanted to review kind of highlights the issues that we're facing here. What you'll see on this slide is a graph that shows the percent of total power being used in the Northwest by source of power. So at the very bottom of the stack, you see the reliable workhorse of the fleet, hydropower. And stacked on top of it is this red bar of nuclear. And then right on top of that is the next workhorse of the grid, coal. And you can see back in 2005, coal represented about 50% of all power that was produced. Today, it represents a scant shadow of that, about 15%. And you can see going into 2035 with planned coal retirements, that is going to diminish down to about 7 to 10%. What's replacing it? Well, natural gas is replacing coal, but the two resources that the Northwest in particular are leaning really heavily on is wind and solar. Now, don't get me wrong. Wind and solar are great resources when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing. And the fuel is free, right? It doesn't cost anything for the wind to blow. And when the sun is up, that's a great resource to harvest energy from. But the problem that we're facing in the nation, and in particular the Northwest, is this whole issue of resource adequacy. And resource adequacy means when we come home at night and we turn our lights on, or we turn the stove on to cook dinner, we have to have enough resources to be able to serve that load at that moment. And if it's not windy and the sun is set, some other resource needs to be providing that power. And if it's not coal, then what's it going to be? Well, it's got to be natural gas. And the problem we're facing with the grid as a whole is we have less dispatchable resources available to meet that fluctuation in our day-to-day load than what the grid really needs. So wind and solar is great when it's there, but it has to be backed up by what we call a dispatchable resource. And the only dispatchable resource that we really have at our disposal is natural gas, if we're replacing coal. Because hydro is already tapped out, and nuclear is a great resource, but it's not able to follow load very well because it likes to operate all on and stay on all hours of the day, all hours of the month, all hours of the year.
So that, to me, that really highlights the need. One, you mentioned dispatchable, meaning like we can turn on this, we'll fire up this plant to meet the load when it's the highest during like the morning hours and the evening hours, but when there's a shortage of those resources, it's a supply and demand issue.
Very much.
We're having to pay more for it, and the region is paying more for it. It's not just us, but everyone. So it's a regional problem, and what are we doing to help with that situation at Kootenai Electric? What sort of influence are we having?
So this is a problem that's going on across the Northwest. Every utility in the Northwest is facing this same problem. We are in a little unique situation in that only 70% of our power comes from the Bonneville fleet. Many of our utility peers have not outgrown their allocation of that, and maybe they're only receiving maybe they only have to supply about 5% of their excess power. For KEC, 30% of our power comes from non-federal resources. We could go to Bonneville and ask Bonneville to also supply that piece, but then we have to be beholden to their policies and their costs. And it's an instrumentality of the federal government. And it's been our experience that while Bonneville has been a good energy partner in making available that inexpensive power that comes from the federal fleet, we don't feel that they've been a good partner in supplying that other 30%. So we've recently joined a power and generation cooperative called PNGC Power. We're one of 23 members of that organization who is self-reliant. We are developing our own fleet of resources that are serving that 30% of power. We're on the beginning stages of this. We have a long way to go, but we are looking at our own fleet of generation, including wind, solar, natural gas, geothermal. And we're making investments so that when we look back 20 years from now, that will be the resources that we own and operate to serve our aggregated needs of all 23 members of PNGC. So we're taking a very engaged and leadership role in making sure that we are self-determining our power supply future. And we believe that that's going to result in lower long-term rates. The unfortunate news is that these things take a lot of time. Let me just backtrack here. I think this is a really good moment to talk about the resource deficit we have and the reason why we have made this decision to be self-deterministic, if you will. If you remember back in January of 2024, we were having a winter vortex. The temperatures over that 5-day span of time was very, very frigid, record lows. During the height of that storm, the Northwest was importing 5 gigawatts of power from the desert Southwest through California into the Northwest to keep the grid stable. The grid threshold between the desert Southwest and Bonneville system was at its peak. They call that a congestion constraint, and there could not have been any incremental flow of power across that grid boundary. 5 gigawatts was as much as it could take. The resource that really kept the Northwest whole was the extra hydropower that Bonneville was able to get out of 4 dams that operate on the Snake River. They were able to ramp their production up just marginally to keep the lights on. The wind wasn't blowing that day. So all of these wind resources that we had in the Northwest weren't producing power. So in that moment of time, 2 years ago, we were deficit 5 gigawatts of power that had we not had the ability to wheel into the Northwest, we would have been facing rolling blackouts. The grid was that close. During that 5-day window of time, Bonneville was buying power out of the Southwest for $200 a megawatt hour and importing it into the Northwest for $1,000 a megawatt hour. All ratepayers in the Northwest, including those in KEC, paid their pro rata share of that freight. That's why it's so crucial that we build resources in the Northwest.
So we are short right now or more by 5 gigawatts. And so a gigawatt is about a million homes. I think of it as like a million homes. It's somewhere around there. So we're short right now 5 gigawatts. And in the future, we're going to be short even more, is what the forecasts are showing. And to give you an idea, there was some information that came out on a study that said we were going to be short 9 gigawatts by the year 2030, which is enough to power the state of Oregon, which is
Mind-blowing.
absolutely alarming to know that in just 4 years, the Northwest can't even have enough power for the state of Oregon. So where is that power going to come from?
And that's not even considering all the additional transmission lines that would need to be built. One transmission line per mile costs between $2 to $8 million. So start doing that math in your head and you arrive at a really large number. One other thing to point out is that the nation has built one nuclear generation station in the last decade. It was Plant Vogtle. It was built on a brownfield site, meaning it already had two reactors on it. They built an additional 2 more. It took us as a country 15 years to build that plant, and it was $20 billion over budget.
Wow.
Over budget.
Mm.
So now start thinking about the logistical challenge of building a whole fleet of generation. But that's the daunting scale that we're facing. And that's one of the fundamental reasons why our rates and the rates of every utility in the Northwest, really in the region, is going up so remarkably, is because those that are providing us power and those that are wheeling that power across their grid to our load is having to bake into the rates that they charge us to recover those costs. We're just now beginning to see the first fruits of that. And I don't want to alarm our members, but I think we would be remiss not to point out the obvious. This isn't something that's going to be cured overnight. This is rate pressure that we as a nation have to be ready to incur to operate a first world electric grid. If we don't incur these costs now, we're going to be like many countries that have third world grids that are exposed to power outages and rolling blackouts. And that is a nightmare that nobody wants to face.
Mm.
You know, as I listen to you talk about, you know, what we had happen in with this winter vortex and how we had to import power from the desert and, you know, and then go through the Cal ISO and export it from the desert and import it into the Northwest. It reminds me, and it almost answers another criticism, I guess, that we have heard occasionally, and that is that you know, Idaho is turning into, you know, California, or you know, how are the so I guess my question is how are the energy policies of other states, you know, affecting KEC? And you've touched on a lot of that, but I just want to rephrase it a little in terms of some of these comments that we've heard.
I would have to say that the conservative values that we all appreciate about Idaho are alive, well, and safe. The rates that we have designed are not a reflection of our desire to do anything like California has done, quite the contrary. However, I would also be amiss in not recognizing that the energy policies of other states aren't affecting the rates that our members have to pay. So this chart highlights this issue very well, Melissa. What this shows is if you look at that red line, that red dashed line on this chart shows the average cost of purchasing power on the market year over year for the last decade, since 2017 to today. And what you'll notice in 2024, there was a market uptick, almost a doubling of market-based power. Reed, this gets back to one of the points that you made earlier, is that we're having a supply and demand problem. We have sucked up all of the additional firm capacity our generation plants are able to produce in the Northwest, and now we're having to rely on other resources like wind and solar to make up the difference. Well, why is wind and solar being built so much? Well, it's because of the renewable portfolio standards that have been implemented by states like Washington, Oregon, and California. The incentives that their portfolio standards have created for power generators is they penalize carbon producing resources like coal and natural gas and incent wind and solar. Well, you cannot rely on wind and solar to be there when the power is needed by our customers. So we have a diminishing portfolio of resources able to flex and follow load being replaced by these non-flexible resources. And this green bar at the very bottom that says Washington Climate Commitment Act perfectly coincides with the uptick that you see. And the reason is that utilities are now being billed for their carbon impact in Washington, and that is having a market response. And all utilities who rely on the grid are having to buy power at these elevated prices now. What's not shown on here is one additional program that is west-wide, grid-wide. It's called WRAP. It's a Western Resource Adequacy Program. And that program is designed to make sure that on our worst day, on the January of 2024, when the grid needs power the most, we have surplus capacity in our generation fleet to be able to serve that load. So that additional generation that is not currently connected to the grid also has to be built. And that's the reason why we are seeing such rapid year-over-year increases in power supply costs. It's going to continue, and unfortunately, it's going to take a long time to get us out of this tranche that we've been benefiting from for the prior 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
5 years ago, I was able to buy power on the market for $30 a megawatt hour. Today, I'd be happy to buy it for 60.
Wow.
One question I'd like you to talk about briefly, if you could, though. Data centers is the buzzword in terms of causing a lot of this. And what I've learned over attending many presentations is there's so many different facets. It's easy to blame one thing. Data centers obviously have an impact. I'd like you to kind of expand on that.
So first of all, one of the things that we heard this week during the symposium that we attended was data centers are really necessary for our national security. So data centers are here to stay. They have a very high load. Just case in point, one data center is usually about 100 megawatts of load. So 10 of them would be 1 gigawatt. So that's kind of the scale that we're talking about. But they're necessary to maintain our competitive edge as a nation. And they're being built everywhere. And I don't want to dismiss the fact that data centers is causing an element of this problem. But frankly, most developers of data centers are not relying on their local utility to supply their needs. They're going out and they're finding their own generation resources to place on site to serve their own load. so they can avoid all the transmission interconnection because the point of generation is right there at the point of use. But that's not to say that that's not causing problems, because they're out competing for the same gen sets that all of the other utilities are needing to meet this additional 9 gigawatts of load that we need. But I would contend that data centers is only a fraction of the problem that is contributing to this. So this is a list of issues that I feel is influencing the pressures on the grid. Data centers, as you see, is at the bottom of the list. But a couple other issues that are addressing, that are factoring into this problem, is the electrification of the transportation industry. My wife and I like to go out for breakfast on Saturdays. And we've been going to the same restaurant for years. And it used to be that in the parking lot, I would see a bunch of F-350 pickup trucks. And about 2 years ago, I remember walking out of breakfast that morning and being somewhat shocked to see 3 EVs parked in the parking lot of this very local restaurant. And I think we see this all over on our roads. The transportation industry is being transformed by electric vehicles. And what do when we come home from night? We plug that electric vehicle in, and that creates grid congestion. So it's not that the grid can't handle it, but it's important that that EV gets plugged in later in the evening after the peak use hours of the grid. Another one is the decarbonization of home and commercial heating. So this isn't as much of an issue in Idaho, but it is in Washington. If you're building a new home or you're renovating a home, you cannot install a natural gas heating system. It has to be electric. And guess what that electric demand is doing to the grid? It's contributing to that 9 gigawatts of power. We also are concerned as a society about the carbon emissions that coal plants have.
Mm-hmm.
So we have been on this path of decommissioning coal-fired generation, which, in addition to hydro, has been the bread and butter of power generation in the nation as a whole. We also, you've probably heard stories in the news about the concerns that the 4 lower Snake River dams have had on fish operations and fish survivability and just the health of the river. I don't want to get into the science behind that, but what I do want to note is that those 4 hydroelectric dams account for 1 nuclear generation station. It's big. I guess the final thing that I would note that's causing grid challenges is just the reindustrialization of the American economy. We are trying to develop and build more domestically. I think we have seen a concern over the years of offshoring all of our industrial capacity. So all these factors are contributing to this need to reinvest and revitalize the grid, and that is expensive.
Mm-hmm.
So Doug, you mentioned EVs earlier and how families are coming home and just plugging in their EV. And I think that, that's something that we can use to talk about the hours that were chosen for the peak use times. And we have heard some feedback from members that we have chosen the worst hours of the day because that is when members either are getting ready in the morning or when they're coming home and they're trying to, have their nightly routine with their families. And, plugging your EV in is a part of that. So can you just expand a little bit on why those hours were chosen?
It is true, Melissa, that these hours come at a very inconvenient time for our members. It does maximize the inconvenience of using electricity, and we get that and we regret that. But one thing to think about is that out of every $100 that we collect in rates, 43 to 45 of those dollars go right around to purchase or produce the power that our members use. Of that $43 to $45, currently 18% of that is directly related to not how much power our members use, but when they use that power. In the next 3 years, that is going to increase from 18% to 25%. So demand charges are becoming much more financially consequential, not just for KEC, but for every utility in the nation. Now, the issue about it being designed for maximum inconvenience is a real one. I'm coming home at the same time that our members do. We like to wash our clothes or cook a dinner. We're watching television. We're turning on our lights. We're heating our homes all at the same time. 2 4-hour blocks of time is when our members are using the most amount of power, and it is the least convenient time to try to be minimizing your utilization. But therein is the problem, because everyone else in the Northwest is doing that exact same thing at the exact same time. We, in part of building up these rates, we looked at our peak demand over the last 10 years, month by month. And in those 120 months that we looked at, all but 4 of our peaks occurred within these 2 4-hour periods of time. So what that says is that these are the times when the most amount of power is being used, and that's the peak that the grid has to be able to be designed to carry. So the fact that it is inconvenient to reduce your load is really just pointing to the issue that the grid as a whole is having to account for. And what we're doing is trying to send that price signal to members to give them the ability to reduce their utilization to the extent possible. And to the extent that it's not possible, that's okay too. We'll build the grid that's necessary to provide that, but it costs money, and our members have to be braced for the cost that incremental load that they're placing on the system is causing. One other thing to bear in mind here is if you have an EV, don't charge your EV when you first come home at night. Don't plug that in at 5 p.m. unless you're willing to pay for that extra demand. Set your charger so that EV will begin charging at 11 or 12 at evening, and it'll be ready to go the next day. And that's the best possible time to charge that vehicle.
Yeah, that's a really good tip. And we've tried to put out, a variety of resources on our website and some helpful videos to explain what members can do to try to reduce that peak use charge. But for those without EVs, it's even as simple as just trying not to stack, the consumption of, the major appliances all at once. If you got to run your dishwasher, program it to run, after the peak use hours have ended. Same thing for washers and dryers and that sort of thing.
Yeah. So another criticism that I've heard is that getting back to the comment you made, that it's at the least convenient hours of the day. But a lot of utilities, when they implement a demand charge, they do so for the demand that is incurred by a customer at any hour of the day. So they will charge like $4 per kW of demand, whether it occurred at noon or at 8 p.m. The rates that we've designed were purposefully structured so that they were somewhat avoidable. So by choosing a peak use demand and giving the first 5 kW of demand at no cost gives our members the ability to shift load around a little bit, and to the extent that their life pattern can be altered, they can take steps, to your point, to shift demand around. A traditional utility design doesn't allow for that.
How about with heating? What are some of the things that members can do to help with heating?
Yeah.
So that seems to be a very common thing. We all need to heat our homes up here in the cold Northwest. So.
Mm-hmm. It's a good question, Reed. There are some simple things that a member can do for home heating. The first one is consider turning your thermostat to preheat or pre-cool your home leading up to one of these 4-hour windows of time, and then just dialing the temperature of your home back a couple degrees during that period. You can't fully avoid a peak use charge in the dead of winter or the heat of the summer, but you can manage the cost of it a little bit differently. Another thing you can do is put your hot water heater on a timer so that it's not coming on during those 4-hour windows of time. And then another thing that you can think about is our peak use charge measures the amount of energy that you use over one contiguous hour. It begins at the beginning of the hour and at the end of the hour. So if you're cooking dinner and you can maybe postpone dinner by a half an hour if your oven has to be on for an hour, you just cut the contribution of your stove in half simply by turning it on at 6:30 instead of 6 if it's going to be on for that whole hour. Little things like that to just shift power and spread it out over the 4-hour window of time will do wonders.
How about let's say someone, I know if you are doing a great job of managing your energy and you mess up one time, you know, why haven't we taken like the average peak usage, or because that is kind of a concern I think many members have.
So think about how that would look on the grid. If we designed for the average peak, how would the grid respond to that when we have a very cold winter? If we're planning for an average, but then we end up experiencing a peak, we're going to end up with brownouts. And the reason why we're having to send the price signal for the peak contribution that a member experiences is the same reason why we're billed for our peak contribution as a utility as opposed to our average.
Right.
It's something that's very hard for us as a utility to navigate around. Our bill is based on it. Same thing is true with a member.
That's a great point. So I think the last question that we have is, have we considered offering a discount to, to seniors or to other, to low income or veterans, and I just wanted to bounce that off you and see.
Reed, you had some good statistics
Yeah,
about this.
so there's been studies done, obviously locally, and they've shown that 68% of the growth in population in Kootenai County is of the 65 and older category. So that's a huge influx of retirees that have come into our community. They're great. We also understand they're on fixed incomes, and at the same time, if we were to do this, it would lower the rates for them. That revenue has to come from somewhere, and it's going to land on squarely on the shoulders of the working families in our membership, who are also stressed and have their own financial stressors as well. So the board has looked at this. They've entertained the idea, but I think they also, speaking of California, we don't want to socialize that in terms of demographics. It just does not make sense for us because someone has to pay for it, and
Right.
it's just too hard of a bridge to cross. So
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, thank you, Doug, for being a guest on the podcast today, and really for answering these direct questions. You've provided a lot of information, and directly addressed some of these concerns that members have had. So,
Yeah, well, thank you, Melissa and Reed. I hope that this podcast, this information that we've shared, has been helpful for members, and I'm really hoping this message gets out and people spend some time thinking about the pressures that the grid is under. And I hope that members, if they have further questions, that they'll reach out to our staff and ask questions. But we also, I guess I would just like to close by saying we feel the rate pressures that our members are under, and we're doing everything that we reasonably can to try to help control that. But we also just selfishly want to avoid being the messenger that gets shot in delivering bad news. And to the extent we can, we will keep our rates as low as we possibly can. But we too are under a lot of pressure, and we're doing the best that we can.
Thanks everyone for tuning in to Electrification Unplugged. We hope you all found this helpful. If you still have questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out to us by phone or email. We're happy to help. And if this is your first time listening, we highly recommend checking out our previous episodes where we cover important aspects of our cooperative and the electric industry. And until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay plugged into the amazing world of electricity.